From the German perspective, this represented an underappreciated hazard. Their defensive calculations frequently centered on demolishing permanent bridge structures and establishing fortified positions along riverbanks, placing trust in natural waters to impose sufficient delays for reserve forces to arrive at threatened sectors. While Wehrmacht engineering personnel excelled at destruction operations, they failed to adequately estimate the flexibility and adaptability demonstrated by their adversaries. The German military also faced critical shortages of petroleum products and transportation assets during the war's latter phases, severely limiting their capacity to challenge crossings once Allied forces had successfully bridged them. In practical terms, the very waterways they depended upon as protective barriers transformed into constraints, severing routes of withdrawal when Allied engineers spanned them with remarkable swiftness. As summer unfolded in 1944, Allied field commanders were already conceptualizing operations wherein armored formations would traverse rivers within hours of making contact with them. Intelligence reports circulated through German command posts describing the accelerated Allied progress following the Normandy breakout, though numerous officers dismissed these accounts as overstatements. Few within the Wehrmacht comprehended that an entire specialized branch of contemporary engineering warfare had been developed with the specific purpose of eliminating the river as an effective obstacle. The presumption of security behind water barriers would shortly be revealed as among the most expensive miscalculations made by German high command. This narrative commences not with the roar of heavy guns or the advance of mechanized forces, but with the metallic sounds of steel floating sections and the steady noise of motors. During the final year of the Second World War, the rate at which floating pontoon structures materialized under hostile fire emerged as a determining element in military success. The cracking of German defensive positions resulted not from overwhelming force alone, but from inventiveness, from the capacity to construct in hours what previously required days of labor. When German military strategists conceived their plans for defending the Reich, they repeatedly regarded rivers as elements of certainty in their calculations. Throughout the late stages of the conflict, commanders positioned along both western and eastern combat zones placed considerable confidence in these natural obstacles. They operated under the assumption that substantial currents like the Seine, the Meuse, the Oder, and most critically the Rhine would impose sufficient delays on enemy advances to permit divisions time for reorganization and mounting counter-offensives. This conviction was not inherently unreasonable. Throughout the history of organized warfare, military forces had relied upon rivers to establish defensive foundations. What rendered the German dependency hazardous, nevertheless, was the misleading sense of durability it provided them in confronting a conflict that had grown increasingly mechanized and characterized by rapid movement. Back in 1940, when Wehrmacht forces swept through France, they had themselves employed river-crossing techniques as methods for rupturing enemy defensive positions. The German war machine had exploited the Meuse river crossing in the vicinity of Sedan, deploying pontoons and assault watercraft to outflank French defences. With bitter irony, merely 4 years afterward, German leadership failed to acknowledge that their opponents had absorbed lessons from those precise tactics and enhanced them on a vastly greater magnitude. The notion that rivers could function as impregnable defensive barriers persisted within German headquarters well beyond the point when the nature of warfare had shifted decisively against them. Wehrmacht defensive schemes leaned extensively on demolition operations. Retreating German formations received orders to obliterate bridges during their withdrawal, abandoning destroyed spans of steel and masonry with the expectation that pursuing armies would be detained for weeks. Following the Allied breakthrough from Normandy throughout August of 44, bridge demolitions became standard procedure. In certain instances, such as at Rouen spanning the Seine, German engineers prepared sophisticated explosive charges to guarantee crossings would be rendered completely unusable. What they underestimated was the capability of Allied forces to respond almost instantaneously with temporary substitutes, circumventing the postponements they anticipated. Portion of German excessive confidence stemmed from their own complications with extensive engineering efforts later in the war. By 44, the German army lacked resources to sustain specialized bridging formations on any significant scale. Scarcities of fuel and transport vehicles meant that even when German engineers could gather pontoons or ferry equipment, they frequently lacked the mobility to deliver them to critical locations promptly. Meanwhile, Allied industrial production had saturated the battlefield with Bailey Bridge elements, prefabricated pontoon sections, and specialized transport vehicles, ensuring that river crossing operations could be executed on a scale the Wehrmacht could no longer replicate. German high command also depended on psychological expectations. They maintained beliefs that expansive rivers would serve as morale-destroying obstacles for advancing soldiers, compelling attackers into expensive frontal assaults. Propaganda distributed throughout the Reich boasted that the Rhine would function as Germany's ultimate protection, a natural defensive moat safeguarding the homeland. Yet as Allied armies advanced, these declarations became progressively disconnected from battlefield reality. Soldiers positioned at the front lines, particularly those engaged in fighting withdrawals across France and Poland, rapidly discovered that rivers no longer guaranteed protection. Numerous Wehrmacht veterans subsequently recalled their astonishment at witnessing enemy armor and transport vehicles rolling across bridges that appeared to have been erected seemingly instantaneously. The dependency on rivers as defensive assurances exposed a more fundamental deficiency in German military thinking. The Wehrmacht continued operating within a 19th-century conceptual framework, envisioning that natural geography itself could furnish time and security when confronting modern logistical capabilities. In actuality, rivers became less a defensive shield than an examination of adaptability, and by late 44, it was the Allies, American, British, and Soviet alike, who had perfected the skill of transforming those examinations into opportunities. Allied preparation for bridging operations represented a comprehensive mobilization of industrial and engineering resources. Specialized equipment was manufactured in tremendous quantities and distributed across multiple theaters of operation. The components were designed for rapid deployment and assembled under battlefield conditions. Among the most renowned of these innovations was the Bailey Bridge, a British creation initially introduced during North African operations and subsequently employed extensively throughout Italy. Its brilliance resided in its sectional construction, sufficiently lightweight to be transported in components by trucks, yet sturdy enough once erected to sustain tanks exceeding 40 tons in weight. For floating operations, engineering units relied substantially on pontoon formations. The United States Army made significant investments in pneumatic pontoons, which could be inflated and connected to establish floating roadways within hours. These were combined with steel treadway sections that permitted Sherman tanks and heavy transport trucks to cross rapidly once the pontoons were positioned. British forces, for their contribution, developed collapsible boats and assault rafts capable of ferrying infantry across swift-moving rivers before heavier equipment could be transported across. The Soviet Union adopted a different methodology. Its engineering troops mass-manufactured wooden pontoons and rafts, supplemented by extensive stockpiles of captured or improvised materials, guaranteeing that they could improvise crossings even without formal bridge-building supplies. The magnitude of Allied preparations was extraordinary. In anticipation of the Normandy invasion, thousands of Bailey Bridge panels were accumulated in southern England. American logistics planners prepared not simply for one or two crossings, but for a continuous campaign spanning multiple waterways. Specialized formations, engineer combat battalions within the United States Army, and Royal Engineers bridging companies within British forces received training specifically to deploy bridges while exposed to artillery and machine gun fire. The Soviets similarly organized complete bridge brigades, comprising thousands of personnel, whose exclusive mission was to construct crossings under combat circumstances. Among the most significant achievements was the synchronization between infantry, armor, and engineering units. Rather than treating bridge construction as an independent operation, Allied strategists incorporated it into their operational schedules. This meant that an advancing division would reach a river already anticipating a crossing to be established within hours. Tanks were detained only momentarily while engineers rushed pontoons into position under protective fire. The consequence was to sustain momentum without interruption, denying German forces the respite they desperately required to reconstitute their defensive lines. Another advancement was the deployment of amphibious transport vehicles. The American-manufactured DUKW, a 6-wheeled truck capable of operating on land and floating on water, demonstrated exceptional value during initial phases of river crossings. Thousands of these amphibious trucks were deployed throughout Europe, transporting troops and equipment across rivers before permanent bridges were completed. Combined with mobile cranes, bulldozers, and additional heavy machinery, they established a mobile engineering toolkit that the Wehrmacht could not equal. By 1944, the distinction between German and Allied engineering resources had become pronounced. The Wehrmacht had once pioneered audacious river operations, but its bridging formations had been diminished through attrition and material shortages. The Allies, conversely, had transformed engineering into an industrial magnitude component of warfare, regarding rivers not as barriers, but as foreseeable challenges to be resolved. For German commanders maintaining their confidence in natural defences, circumstances were aligned for an unwelcome revelation. Rivers no longer offered protection, only the occasion for Allied forces to demonstrate their resourcefulness. The transformation of river crossings into rapid, decisive tactical movements depended not exclusively on innovative equipment, but also on the intensive training of specialized formations. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, entire battalions had undergone months of preparation to execute complicated bridging operations under duress. Within the United States Army, engineer combat battalions conducted training exercises in England that replicated nocturnal crossings under simulated fire, with smoke screens deployed to conceal movement and aircraft furnishing overhead protection. British Royal Engineers likewise performed repeated exercises along the Thames and throughout training facilities across southern England, practicing how to assemble Bailey bridges in exceptional time. What characterized these preparations was the concentration on velocity. Military training manuals emphasized that delays at river positions could unravel entire offensive operations. Consequently, engineers received training to function in conditions that replicated battlefield environments. Darkness, mud, hostile fire, and chaotic coordination with armored formations waiting impatiently on the opposite shoreline. Soldiers became proficient at managing heavy steel panels, inflatable pontoons, and assault boats with notable efficiency. Historical accounts from the period describe engineers assembling spans in merely a few hours that only a generation previously would have consumed days. The Soviets, operating along the Eastern Front where rivers were broader and conditions frequently more severe, adopted even more demanding training programs. Red Army sappers practiced using storm boats, camouflage methods, and rapid raft construction utilizing locally available lumber. They learned to ferry not merely infantry, but complete artillery batteries across rivers like the Dnieper. Soviet commanders expected their engineers to perform while under direct threat from Luftwaffe air raids and German artillery bombardments, pushing their endurance to extreme limits. By the winter spanning 43 to 44, Soviet bridging brigades had acquired reputations for their capability to improvise under circumstances that would have immobilized most armies. A fundamental component of preparation involved logistics. Constructing a pontoon bridge demanded immense quantities of materials, tons of steel, timber, rubber pontoons, and heavy transport vehicles. The United States Army alone transported thousands of tons of bridging equipment across the Atlantic in preparation for the European campaign. In certain cases, entire shipping convoys were dedicated to carrying Bailey Bridge components, which could be unloaded at ports and transported inland by truck. By summer 44, Allied armies advancing through France possessed mobile reserves of bridging material prepared to be deployed at immediate notice. Coordination between different military branches represented another determining factor. Air superiority, which Allied forces had secured by mid-44, permitted bridging formations to operate without the persistent threat of air attack that had plagued earlier campaigns. Smoke-generating equipment was deployed to shield bridge construction operations from German artillery observation, while infantry formations were assigned to secure bridgeheads on the far shoreline before engineers commenced construction. In numerous instances, tanks and self-propelled artillery provided covering fire directly from the riverbank, establishing a protective screen behind which engineering personnel could work. German forces, confronting these disciplined and well-equipped formations, were frequently caught off guard by the speed of execution. Reports from Wehrmacht officers describe amazement at observing entire armoured formations cross bridges that seemed to materialise overnight. This accelerated tempo resulted from relentless training, integrated planning, and recognition that rivers could no longer be regarded as passive defensive positions. By the latter portion of the war, Allied armies had transformed bridging from an obstacle into a demonstration of technological and organisational supremacy. The initial genuine demonstration of Allied bridging rapidity that truly astonished German command occurred during the dramatic pursuit across France throughout August 44. After breaking out from Normandy during Operation Cobra, Allied armies surged eastward at an unanticipated pace. German defensive strategy depended on decelerating this momentum by retreating behind the Seine River, believing its breadth and demolished bridges would stall the enemy for weeks. The Wehrmacht destroyed crossing points near Paris, Rouen, and Mantes, anticipating the advancing Anglo-American forces would be detained long enough for reinforcements to establish a defensive position further east. Instead, the reverse transpired. Within days of reaching the Seine, Allied engineer formations were already deploying pontoons and Bailey bridges under combat circumstances. At Vernon, British forces conducted an audacious assault crossing between the 25th and 27th of August, ferrying infantry across in storm boats before engineers erected a temporary bridge for armour. Despite substantial German resistance, the bridgehead was swiftly secured, and tanks belonging to the Guards' armoured division rolled across within 48 hours. The velocity of this crossing stunned German defenders, who had been assured by their commanders that the river would restrain the British for at minimum a fortnight. Within the American sector, the pattern replicated itself. At Montez-Gassicourt, elements belonging to the United States 19th Corps crossed the Seine on August 19th, utilizing assault boats, with bridging battalions erecting a heavy pontoon bridge shortly thereafter. Within less than 2 days, American armour was crossing en masse, driving deep into German positions. Another crossing at Melun allowed Patton's Third Army to exploit the breach, pushing rapidly toward the Moselle. In aggregate, Allied armies established multiple bridgeheads across the Seine within a matter of days, creating a shockwave that reverberated through German command structures. The rapidity of these operations produced a devastating psychological impact. German intelligence officers reported to Berlin that Allied forces appeared to be disregarding natural obstacles, an acknowledgement that the long-standing confidence in rivers as defensive barriers was deteriorating. Many German formations retreating from Normandy found themselves unable to reorganize because Allied forces were across the Seine before their units could reconstitute. Survivors recalled the confusion of attempting to retreat eastward, only to discover that Allied armour was already advancing beyond the river position. From a logistical perspective, the Seine crossings demonstrated how Allied planning had achieved near-industrial efficiency. Entire convoys of bridging material advanced behind the spearheads, ensuring that equipment was constantly available. Pontoon bridge sections were transported forward in synchronized waves, while Bailey Bridge components followed in truck convoys. Each crossing was less an isolated achievement of improvisation and more the implementation of a well-rehearsed system that had been perfected since North Africa. For German defence, the episode marked a turning point in their perception of the enemy. The myth of delay behind rivers evaporated in less than a week. Officers who had once confidently declared that France's rivers would furnish natural defensive lines were compelled to confront a harsh reality. Allied mobility supported by rapid engineering meant that even major waterways could not guarantee respite. From this moment forward, Each successive retreat eastward carried a sense of futility, as German troops realized that the enemy's capability to span rivers in hours had rendered one of their most trusted defensive strategies obsolete. While the Seine crossings shocked German commanders in the west, it was along the Eastern Front that the authentic scale of engineering innovation became visible. The Red Army, advancing steadily from 43 onward, confronted some of the largest rivers in Europe, the Dnieper, the Vistula, and ultimately the Oder. These waterways were not narrow channels, but immense obstacles, frequently several kilometers in width with marshy banks and rapid currents. German planners anticipated them to halt Soviet offensives for months, especially considering the widespread destruction of permanent bridges. Yet Soviet engineers, hardened by years of retreat and recovery, had mastered the technique of overcoming these formidable barriers with ruthless efficiency. The most celebrated example emerged during the Dnieper offensive throughout autumn 43. After the liberation of Kiev was ordered, Soviet forces launched what became recognized as the Battle of the Dnieper, among the largest river-crossing operations in recorded history. Entire armies were ferried across in storm boats, improvised rafts, and even barrels lashed together. Soviet sappers constructed pontoon bridges under constant artillery and air attack, frequently at night, while infantry clung to hastily assembled ferries. Despite sustaining enormous casualties, the Red Army succeeded in forcing multiple bridgeheads across the river within weeks, overwhelming German defences that had been proclaimed impenetrable. By 44, Soviet bridging tactics had become even more sophisticated. During Operation Bagration in June, engineers rapidly spanned rivers such as the Berezina and the Niemen, enabling armoured spearheads to maintain momentum deep into Belarus. German troops reported astonishment at how quickly Soviet pontoons materialized, sometimes within hours of a breakthrough. At the Vistula in January 45, the Red Army constructed bridges sturdy enough for tanks and artillery within days, allowing the massive offensive toward Berlin to proceed without pause. Perhaps the most striking demonstration transpired at the Oder River in March 45. German propaganda had proclaimed the Oder as the final Great Wall before the capital. Yet Soviet engineers, supported by artillery barrages and nocturnal operations, established bridgeheads almost immediately after reaching the river. Temporary pontoon bridges were positioned despite flooding and fierce counterattacks. Within a brief period, heavy armour was rolling across, establishing conditions for the final assault on Berlin. German defenders, exhausted and short of supplies, found themselves unable to exploit even this vast waterway to slow the inevitable. Soviet ingenuity extended beyond conventional bridging techniques. Engineers frequently improvised with local materials, logs, barges, and even agricultural equipment repurposed for river crossings. In numerous instances, villagers were conscripted to assist in carrying timber or lashing rafts together. The scale of manpower available to the Red Army meant that even colossal rivers could be crossed through sheer determination and organization. German accounts describe disbelief at how entire divisions seemed to materialize on the far bank overnight, despite the river that was supposed to protect them. The Eastern Front also highlighted a brutal reality. These crossings were achieved at immense human cost. Thousands of Soviet engineers and infantrymen perished in the first waves, often drowning under fire or succumbing to icy waters. Yet their sacrifice enabled the relentless momentum of Soviet offensives. For the Wehrmacht, it proved that no natural barrier, regardless of how wide or forbidding, could guarantee safety once the Red Army committed itself. The illusions constructed around the Dnieper, Vistula, and Oder collapsed in the same manner as those around the Seine, eroded not by time, but by the to build bridges with astonishing speed. By the spring of 45, the final obstacle that loomed largest in German strategic thinking was the Rhine River. Stretching across western Germany, it had long been regarded as a natural frontier and was celebrated in German culture and history as a symbol of national defence. The Führer himself proclaimed that the Rhine would form an unbreachable wall against the advancing Allies. Bridges along its length were systematically demolished and defenders prepared to contest any crossing. The German population, worn down by years of war, placed hope in the river as the last line of security before the heartland. Yet Operation Plunder, launched by the Allies in March 1945, would demonstrate conclusively that such confidence was misplaced. The Rhine crossing was meticulously prepared. Under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, British and American forces amassed enormous stockpiles of bridging material on the western bank. Entire engineer divisions were assigned to construct pontoon and Bailey bridges under fire, while deception operations misled the Germans as to the crossing sites. Meanwhile, American forces under General Omar Bradley and George Patton planned parallel operations further south, ensuring that the crossing would not be localized but executed on a broad front. The operation began on the night of March 23rd, when British and American infantry stormed across in assault boats supported by one of the heaviest artillery barrages of the war. Almost immediately, engineer units moved in, erecting treadway bridges using steel pontoons. Despite fierce German resistance, the first bridge suitable for tanks was completed within hours. By dawn on March 24th, Allied armour was already moving across, and within days multiple crossings were functioning, including a massive pontoon structure at Wesel. Perhaps the most dramatic episode, however, was the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen by elements of the United States 9th Armored Division on March 7th, weeks before plunder officially began. Against all German expectations, the bridge had not been fully destroyed in time, and American troops seized it intact. Engineers immediately reinforced the damaged structure while simultaneously building pontoons nearby to ensure redundancy. This surprise crossing created a bridgehead across the Rhine far earlier than German planners thought possible, accelerating the collapse of defences. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented. The Allies deployed hundreds of amphibious vehicles, assault boats, ferries, and floating bridge sections, working day and night to maintain supply lines. Smoke screens blanketed the river to obscure German artillery observers, while aircraft dominated the skies, preventing the Luftwaffe from intervening effectively. Within a week, entire Allied armies were streaming across, including tanks, artillery, and endless convoys. For German defenders, the psychological blow was devastating. Soldiers who had been told that the Rhine was impregnable now watched as the enemy built pathways across its waters in record time. Reports from German officers described panic and disbelief, with some units collapsing before they could even mount counterattacks. The illusion of safety behind the river was shattered, and with it the last coherent defensive line west of Berlin. Operation Plunder and the events at Remagen proved beyond doubt that the age of natural barriers had ended. The ability to erect floating pontoon bridges in mere hours transformed the strategic landscape, making even Europe's most formidable rivers obstacles only in theory. In practice, Allied engineering turned them into little more than temporary inconveniences. The German expectation that the Rhine would hold back the Allied advance dissolved almost instantly, paving the way for the final push into the Ruhr and ultimately the capital itself. By the closing weeks of the war in Europe, the myth of rivers as shields had disintegrated entirely. From the Seine to the Oder, the speed and precision of Allied bridging operations had revealed a profound transformation in modern warfare. Engineering had become a decisive arm, equal in importance to infantry, armour, and artillery. German commanders who had once planned entire campaigns around the expectation that waterways would buy them weeks of time now found themselves outmaneuvered and outpaced at every turn. The rapid construction of floating pontoon bridges exposed the vulnerability of static defences in a world where mobility and industrial production dictated the outcome of battles. One of the most striking consequences of this collapse was the paralysis of German retreat. On both the western and eastern fronts, Wehrmacht units discovered that their fallback lines, carefully selected along rivers, offered no true respite. Instead, they often became death traps. Entire divisions retreating in the belief that a river would cover their withdrawal were overtaken when Allied engineers spanned the obstacle overnight. At the Seine, thousands of German troops were cut off and captured. On the Vistula and Oder, retreating formations found themselves encircled as Red Army bridging units established crossings faster than expected. What had been envisioned as safety became isolation. The collapse of this illusion also carried enormous psychological weight. German soldiers who once believed propaganda promising that rivers like the Rhine or Oder were insurmountable barriers now witnessed tanks rolling over newly built pontoon spans within hours of their arrival. Prisoner interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence in 44 and 45 repeatedly highlighted disbelief among captured troops. Many admitted that they had been ordered to hold positions only until rivers could guarantee protection, a guarantee that dissolved in the face of Allied bridging. This loss of faith undermined morale and hastened desertions. Beyond the battlefield, the engineering feats carried political and symbolic resonance. The Rhine, long celebrated as a cornerstone of German identity, was crossed in force not once but multiple times in the spring of 45. The rapid Allied bridging operations symbolized the collapse of the Führer's promises and the failure of his defensive strategy. For the Soviets, storming the Oder and pushing pontoons toward Berlin carried an equally powerful message. The Reich's heartland was no longer shielded by nature. The propaganda value of these crossings was immense, demonstrating to soldiers and civilians alike that nothing could prevent the inevitable. Historians later recognized that the bridging operations were as much a triumph of industrial capacity as of tactical brilliance. Allied forces could deploy thousands of trucks, workshops, and prefabricated components, ensuring that any destroyed bridge could be replaced in record time. The Germans, starved of resources and crippled by constant shortages, could not replicate this feat. Their reliance on natural obstacles revealed not only a misreading of modern warfare, but also their inability to compete in the industrial race that defined the conflict. By May 45, as Germany lay in ruins, the lesson was clear. Rivers had ceased to be barriers of permanence. The capacity to improvise, to construct in hours under fire what once took days, had tipped the balance decisively. Floating pontoon bridges were not just military tools. They became symbols of inevitability, proving that no natural feature could halt the advance of armies equipped with the full might of modern engineering. For the Germans, who had never expected such feats to be possible, the realization came too late, marking the final collapse of a defensive illusion that had once seemed unshakable.